Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Red Alert for PC and PlayStation, and it was later re-released on PlayStation Network. This is a real-time strategy game developed by Westwood Studios and originally published by Virgin Interactive, although it's now published by Electronic Arts. And it's fairly interesting because this was the sequel of sorts to the original Command & Conquer. It's not really a sequel, but they originally tried to tie it in with the Tiberian games, and that was generally considered a pretty big mistake. So what ended up happening was that Red Alert actually became its own sub-series in the Command & Conquer series. And the explanation for it was that there was just some sort of alternate timeline created from time travel experiments. It was just weird. But ultimately, this became pretty much the highest rated Command & Conquer game ever. It was insanely well received at the time it came out in 1996, and even years afterwards, tons of people look back on this thing with nostalgia, where they may not have even heard of the original Command & Conquer, oddly enough. So this was kind of the big entry point to the series for a lot of people. And the question becomes, how is it compared to the original Command & Conquer, and once again, does it stand on its own, or is it more of a historical curiosity at this point? Well, as far as the presentation goes, it's about the same as the original Command & Conquer, although it does have a bit more detail in some of the sprite work, and it's also a bit more modern in that it will actually run properly on modern systems, with some fairly minimal patching or tweaking, so that definitely helps in the age department, but at the same time, it still looks about the same as the original Command & Conquer. Most things are very highly undetailed. And like the original game, they also have FMV cutscenes, and they're about the same quality as they were in the original game. The difference being that the acting is slightly better. Although the accents tend to be really horribly butchered for the most part, whether you're talking about the Allied forces or the Soviets. It's pretty ridiculous just how much they butcher some of those accents.
Somewhere inside this research center, the Soviets hold Albert Einstein. We need him back, immediately. Get Tanya inside, so she can get Einstein out.
Congratulations on earning this assignment, Commander. I am Captain Georgy Kukov, Chief of Field Operations for this region.
But also, like the original game, the sound effects really aren't all that great, and the soundtrack is, once again, absolutely fantastic. Again, it's Frank Klepacki doing his thing, and the interesting thing about Red Alert compared to the original Command & Conquer is that it actually feels like a separate entity in terms of its soundtrack, even though stylistically they're pretty close. So that they managed to pull off something like that is actually pretty interesting. This one's soundtrack feels a bit more militaristic and aggressive than the original Command & Conquer's, which was a bit more groovy, oddly enough. So they managed to make this feel more like a straight-up war scenario, even though it's still a lot of music you can certainly dance to if you wanted. So once again, the soundtrack just steals the show in terms of presentation, and everything else is pretty much how the original game did it, just with some very slight improvements here and there. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is set in the 1950s era of a parallel universe in which Albert Einstein actually went back in time and eliminated Hitler before he even rose to power, thus basically eliminating World War II up until a certain point when the Soviet Union starts to become aggressive and invades Europe. So of course the nations of Europe form an alliance and go up against the Soviet Union, and so the real story of the game is that both sides are vying for control of mainland Europe, and there's not really much else, actually. There is a plot to it, but it's fairly minimal, and they try to tie it in on occasion with the original game, Tiberian Dawn, and it doesn't really work out all that well. There's just only token references. There's the appearance of the guy who played Kane, quite possibly as Kane, during the Soviet campaign, but other than that, there's not really all that much properly tying this thing to the Tiberian series, so they actually went their separate ways after this particular game, and that ended up being for the better. But The plot in this one is not particularly strong. It's stronger than it was in the original Command & Conquer. It's not really much better, and it actually kind of grossly oversimplifies some things. For example, it basically portrays the Soviets as these horrible machinations of Stalin. And granted, Stalin was a horrible, horrible man, and just an absolutely brutal dictator. So if you decide to play the Soviet campaign, for example, and you're sitting there listening to Stalin give his briefings and such, and he's talking about how you're just supposed to exterminate so many populations and things, it is appropriate for the actual historical person, because he did want tons of people exterminated, but it's kind of jarring when you think about where this series went from here, and how it actually started to camp things up with the Red Alert series, and the Tiberian series is where things got a bit darker and stayed more serious. But this one here is actually surprisingly dark. It's just kind of an interesting observation. It doesn't really affect the actual plot of the game because it's told competently and everything. But just looking back on things with the more historical perspective makes it just feel like it's kind of out of place compared to the rest of the Red Alert games. But as far as the campaign structure goes, it's definitely better than the original Command & Conquer, mostly because it actually gives you a very strong idea of what to do. And not only that, but just the way they've structured out the missions is better. You have a fair amount more variety than you did in the original game, where it was mostly just go and slaughter everything. In this one, you might have some very, very specific objectives. For example, the very first mission of the Allied campaign has you infiltrating a Soviet base and extracting Einstein, who's been captured. And if you try to do basically what you would have done in, say, the original Command & Conquer, which is just to roll right in and mow everything down, you're probably going to fail the mission. So it's just kind of interesting that they throw in things like that and make it more varied and actually have more of a proper campaign in this one, at least for both these campaigns, than just a bunch of missions that are strung together that are mostly just the same kind of thing you would have in Dune 2. This is where the series really started to differentiate itself from Dune 2, because Command & Conquer was basically just an iteration of Dune 2. It had a lot of the same problems, although it was cleaner and easier to play. And this one basically just takes Command & Conquer and brings everything that it brought to the table, adds some content, tweaks a few things, and basically redoes the campaign structure for the most part. And it works a lot better as a result. People who are going back and trying to play these older Command & Conquer games will find that Red Alert 1 is actually a fairly modern game in sensibility, if not in complexity, and if not in depth. It's still a very simplistic game. It's still got some issues with regards to production, where you can only produce one unit at a time at any specific structure. For example, if you wanted to train some infantry, you can't queue them up. You can only train one at a time. This was something that was in Dune 2 and, of course, Command & Conquer, but it got more annoying as the series went on. And especially if you're going back to it, when unit queues these days are a standard feature, and they have been since the mid to late 90s. So this is right around that time when unit queues started to become a major thing. And this game doesn't have them. So training units is actually kind of tedious in this game. And just producing things in general is kind of tedious. You can only build one building at a time. So all you people worried about your actions per minute or whatever the hell you call it in, say, StarCraft are going to just be freaking out about this one, because you can't do a whole lot. Even though it is a fairly fast-paced RTS, and it's certainly about the same pacing as the original Command & Conquer, there just aren't a lot of things you will be doing at any given point. You're either training units or building things, or you're actually in the middle of a battle. And the combat is once again very simplistic. Everything is basically down to, is it good against infantry or is it good against vehicles, and there's not much else. So once again, it's going to boil down to your infantry is basically useless against vehicles unless it's a specific kind of infantry, so having a bunch of mixed units is generally a good idea. and it's also generally a good idea to just move in with a large force to smash your opponents with overwhelming force, which happens to be something that the Soviets are really good at in this game because they get the heaviest armor that you can get. So it's pretty easy for them to just smash through things, and the Allies tend to focus more on the kind of light mixed unit tactics, where they don't really have any heavy vehicles, but they have a good mixture of things and generally have some decent counters for heavier vehicles if you can get enough of them trained in enough of a time. And that becomes kind of the problem. You see, they added in a skirmish mode, which is what you're seeing right now, and this skirmish mode has AI that is pretty much cheating at all times. They'll have a base built up almost immediately, and when you go over there to find that they have a huge force and you can't even manage to deal with that, well, it gets pretty annoying. So you tend to find that the skirmish mode drags on and on and on, because you'll just end up in these stalemates where they can produce units faster than you can for some reason, and you just kind of have to wait until you have a ridiculously huge force in order to actually be able to conquer anything. So it really becomes more of a numbers game than anything else. Do you have more units than the enemy does? Well, congratulations, you're probably going to win. And that's pretty much it, really. There's not much strategic depth to this game at all. And that also stems from the original Command & Conquer. That game didn't have much strategic depth either. These are very simplistic games, and if you try to go into them as a modern RTS player, you're going to find that they're basically the casual side of RTS, in that you don't have to have much strategic knowledge to actually be able to win the game. I mean, there's only one resource, and you can't get any sorts of fast production going, so it's not like this is going to turn into a micro game where you're just going to have a Zerg rush at the beginning of the game, basically. No, it doesn't really work like that. And especially when you compare it to later games in the series like Tiberian Sun and Red Alert 2, and of course later on, it just feels archaic. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, don't get me wrong. You can still get some enjoyment out of this game if you just want to go in and mess around and not really play the game very seriously, because that's pretty much how you have fun with this thing. If you want to play something serious that has some strategic depth, look elsewhere. This is one of those stepping stones on the way to what we know as RTSs today, and it is definitely affected by its time. It's a very simplistic game with some very simplistic mechanics, very simplistic countering that you can do. And looking back on it, there's not really all that much reason to play it apart from the historical value, or if you're already a Command & Conquer fan and you just want to go back and find out how the series was. Like I said, this is more enjoyable than the original Command & Conquer was. It's more of a straight-up RTS than that was. And it's definitely feeling slightly less archaic than the original Command & Conquer, and certainly Dune 2. But it's hard to go back to this thing. That said, if you try it out and you end up liking it, there is quite a bit of content there. There's actually 2 expansion packs, which are Aftermath and Counter-Strike, and they add some missions to the game, and in the case of Aftermath, they add a fair number of units, particularly things like the Tesla tank and the Tesla soldier, and that's certainly interesting, but the ultimate crux of this is that the gameplay is hard to go back to just because it's archaic compared to pretty much every other RTS since. So if you're looking for something simple, or you just want to see how Command & Conquer used to be, I can recommend looking at this. But otherwise, it's hard to recommend looking at it, because, again, it's just been eclipsed in so many ways. But at least it stands on its own more than the original game does, where the original really does feel like a historical curiosity, and this one, less so. Thanks for watching.